So, well, okay, so just to welcome everybody to our April Social Policy Research Centre webinar, we should call it, and which is being recorded. So if anyone misses it and would like to listen, which I hope they will be able to do so, and it will be posted up in on the SPRC YouTube channel. I'd like to very much welcome Erica Howard, who's my colleague in the Department of Politics, Law and Politics, and who has been working for many years on issues of religious discrimination and some of the intersectional aspects around race and gender, religion and gender and sexuality, etc. So what she's going to be, the title of today's talk is Continuing Controversies about the Wearing of Headscarves and Face Veils. And I thought of asking Erica to talk about this because she has written a great deal about it, but it's because in finishing this book on gender and migration with Anastasia, the issues of headscarves came up to the fore again because of the Swiss referendum. So this is not an issue that is buried in the past. It may be less kind of active in the UK, but certainly in other European countries, it's very, very active, and particularly around the full face veil. So no more ado, I very much welcome Erica, who is Professor of Law in the Department of Law and Politics. So over to you, Erica.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Yeah, it's a constantly developing area of law. And in fact, I did a book in 2012, and I did a second edition in 2019. And even since, there have been a lot of developments and things have moved on. When I wrote the first book in 2012, only France and Belgium had laws against the wearing of face covering veils in public places. Now, Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark have such laws, and the Netherlands has laws in specific places like schools, hospitals, public transport, and government buildings. And Eleanor's already mentioned the regional the ban in Switzerland, where they just voted for a ban. Germany and Spain, there are certain regions that have bans. And of course, France is now looking into proposing bans on headscarves for under 18s. So in that sense, it is a continuing controversy, so it keeps me in ideas for writing. Now, you remember that Boris Johnson at one stage talked about burqa or niqab wearing people as letterboxes of bank robbers. And in a sense, that shows sort of the role that bans on the wearing of religious symbols play in political discourse and in the media. And it seems to be that especially the wearing of headscarves and face veils are the part of the debate, and they are debated everywhere. And I think it's partly because many European states have seen an influx of migrants, often Muslim migrants, who practice their religion in a much more open and public way, while the traditional Christian religions have really gone much more to the background and into the private sphere. So in the one hand, those countries have become secularized, but the Christian values are still very much entrenched in societies there. But the newcomers, these migrants, are seen as a threat to these Christian values, but I think even more so as a threat to the liberal value of tolerance that they see. And because Muslims are often the biggest group and the loudest group, and because of course, terrorist acts linked to the Muslim religion, that seems to be the target of many of these sort of feelings of threat. Muslims are seen as a threat to liberal, tolerant, secular societies. Of course, you can ask whether a society is really liberal and tolerant if it doesn't tolerate Muslim people. But here are some of the different veils, and I won't mention all of them. I will today talk about the hijab as the veil that doesn't cover the face, and the niqab and the burqa as a veil that covers the face or part of the face. And that's what I sort of in my talk will do. One of the things that I need to point out is that the existing bans across Europe on face covering veils are all really phrased in very neutral language. They cover the covering of the face. But colloquially, everybody calls them burqa bans, which shows the real target of these bans, I think. But of course, if you have a law that prohibits the symbols of one religion, you might get into trouble with discrimination law. So that might be discrimination against certain religions. But there's another couple of things that I need to point out. Most Western Europeans favor some restriction on Muslim women's religious clothing, especially on face covering clothing. On the other hand, the second point that I want to point out, the burqa is hardly ever worn in Europe. It's usually, if people cover their face, they wear covering clothing and a nightcap. And then there's very few women who wear a face covering, a burqa or a nightcap in public places or in Europe. France, the estimate is, and that's probably an overestimate, is 1,900 to 2,000 people out of a Muslim population of about 5 million. In the Netherlands, it's 300 women. In Austria, it's 150 women. So they have a law against something that only 150 women wear. So that's some of the things that I wanted to point out. Now, of course, COVID-19 has also really showed more or less the hypocrisy of face covering bans. And it's even so that in France, face masks are mandated. You have to wear a face mask, but you cannot wear a burqa or nightcap. So a woman could be fined for not wearing a face mask and for wearing a nightcap. And one of the arguments that has been used to justify bans on face covering veils is this argument that they hindered respect for the minimum requirements of life in society, of living together. And what's behind there is that the face plays such an important role in human interaction. The European Court of Human Rights has accepted this argument, although not all the judges agreed with that. And the Human Rights Committee did not accept this argument. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about. How have these arguments played out in court cases? I want to talk about 3 different courts. Bans on the wearing of religious symbols can constitute a violation of an individual's human rights to freedom of religion, which includes the right to manifest your religion. It could also be a breach of anti-discrimination law, both nationally and internationally. So bans in law or in employers' workplace policies have been challenged in these different forums on both of these grounds. Now, there's 2 European courts. We've got the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union. And they both have had cases dealing with headscarves and face veil bans. And really, their case law has made things more confusing and less clear than ever before. And in a sense, you could say that generally they have not been very sympathetic or very positive or very supportive of women who want to wear headscarves or face veils. Both courts have upheld face veil bans, workplace bans on face veils and headscarves as justified interferences with the right to freedom of religion and the right not to be discriminated against. The Human Rights Committee, which is a United Nations body overseeing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has made a different decision. I just put these 3 bodies on there and the different sort of a different symbol for each of them, so we can keep up with what court, what body has done what. So different decisions. And that makes things even more unclear and confusing. This slide has Article 9 of the European Convention, which guarantees freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And if you look at the first paragraph, it says that includes the right to manifest your religion or belief. And then the second paragraph says that the freedom to manifest your religion or belief can be subject to restrictions, but only if this is prescribed by law, and if this is necessary in a democratic society in the interest of public safety, for the protection of public order, health and morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Now, this necessary in a democratic society means that it must fulfill a pressing social needs. And again, that has been explained as it must pursue a legitimate aim, and those legitimate aims are in Article 9.2. But it must also be proportionate and necessary. And proportionality and necessity, that looks at whether there is a fair balance between the interest of the state to restrict a practice and the interest of the individual in exercising their rights. There's another article of the Convention, which is Article 14, which prohibits discrimination on a large number of grounds, including religion. And bans are sometimes challenged as a breach of this discrimination article. Bans on hijabs, niqabs, burqas could be seen as gender discrimination. And Helena just mentioned something on that. And they are gender discrimination because they're only worn by women. But the argument on discrimination has not really been addressed by the European Court of Human Rights or the Court of Justice of the European Union. The European Court of Human Rights applies a Justification Test to the discrimination article. So unequal treatment is not against the law if there is an objective and reasonable justification. And again, that means there has to be a legitimate aim, and the means tried to achieve that aim must be proportionate and necessary. So it's a similar test. So in that sense, in all these, in both Article 9, the freedom of religion, and Article 14, the non-discrimination right, there is a proportionality test. And the proportionality test is a balancing of interests. And it is the right of the individual to manifest their religion and the right of the state in restricting that, in achieving a legitimate aim to achieve that, to achieve a legitimate aim, so a ban, a restriction on the right. Now, if we look at the United Nations, there is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that has similar articles. Article 18 guarantees the freedom of religion and the freedom to manifest your religion, and Article 26, which prohibits discrimination. And the covenant is overseen by the UN Human Rights Committee. But again, there is a proportionality test. So it's very similar to the European Convention, the International Covenant and the European Convention, both guarantee freedom of religion, both say that your manifestation of religion can be restricted. And in the EU, we have a Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which also guarantees freedom of religion and freedom to manifest your religion. But the EU is also different in the sense that it has a number of directives. And a directive means that a directive prescribes that a member state has to adopt laws against discrimination. And the main directive is Directive 2078, which prohibits discrimination on, amongst other grounds, religion or belief. Now, I have to say a little bit more about EU law. And because I don't want to read this out, I put the exact definition on the slide. As a lawyer, I don't want you to tell me that I haven't told it properly. But EU law makes a difference between direct and indirect discrimination. And the European Court of Human Rights and the Human Rights Committee do not make that distinction. They allow justification for both. EU law does not allow justification for direct discrimination, except in very limited circumstances, which are described in the law, but it allows justification of indirect discrimination. Now, what's the difference? Direct discrimination is basically treating somebody less favorably than somebody else has been or would be treated on the prohibited grounds, so in this case, religion or belief. So you could say if you prohibit Muslim symbols only, you discriminate between Muslims and other religions. Indirect discrimination is basically where a neutral rule or provision applies to everybody in the same way, but where some people are at a disadvantage because of the rule. And that often can happen with dress requirements. For example, if you neutral dress codes could be indirectly discriminatory against non-Christian religions, which are more likely to have dress requirements, religious dress requirements. A rule that nobody can wear anything on their head at work, for example, that applies to all employees. Nobody can do it. So it's a general neutral rule. But some people who wear things on their head because of religious reasons cannot comply with that. So, as I said, the difference is important, and the difference is in what's at the bottom of the slide, that indirect discrimination is not against the law if it's objectively justified by a legitimate aim and the means of achieving that aim are appropriate and necessary. So again, here we have a proportionality test, a balancing test, and there is a proportionality test again. But there is a difference between the rights under the European Convention and under the European Convention on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the one hand, and EU law, because the first two apply between an individual and the state. EU law goes a lot further, and EU discrimination law prohibits discrimination in private settings as well. So discrimination by private persons. So the balancing is very similar, but in this case, you have on the one hand the right of the employee, on the other hand, the interest of the employer. But again, it's a proportionality test. And part of that test is, as you can see here, proportionality also includes looking at whether it's necessary and no more than necessary. In other words, can something be achieved? Can the restriction, can the limitation that they say we need be achieved by less restrictive and less discriminatory means? And if they can, then that should be used. And I must at this point admit that I have blatantly plagiarized the slides of Alice Donald for her session that I usually do with her on the wearing of religious symbols. So thank you, Alice, for these lovely images. But let's have a look at what the different courts have done. And I want to look at what these courts have done, what they have used as arguments to ban or to accept bans on the wearing of religious symbols, and especially headscarves and face veils. And the first one is the case of SAS versus France. And that was a case in the European Court of Human Rights based on a challenge under the European Convention. And it was a challenge against the French ban on banning people from wearing face covering in public places. The law in France actually imposes criminal fines if people are seen wearing these things. The case went to the Grand Chamber, and in the European Court of Human Rights system, cases are usually heard by a chamber of 7 judges, but sometimes they go to the Grand Chamber of 17 judges. And in this case, sometimes that is because they are appealed to the Grand Chamber, but in this case, the chamber, what they call relinquished jurisdiction. Basically, they said, let's send it to the Grand Chamber because there is a serious question affecting the interpretation of the convention. Or it might be that they said, let's send it to the Grand Chamber because that's where it will end up in the end, probably anyway. But the French government had 3 arguments for the ban. They said, we need it for public safety. We need it for gender equality, equality between men and women, and respect for the dignity of the person. Now, the dignity of the person was based on the argument that face veils, face covering clothing, effaces these women in the public space, and that is dehumanizing. And the third argument I've already mentioned is that it was needed to ensure compliance with the minimum requirements of life in society. The argument about living together requires it. The Grand Chamber rejected the public safety argument, and they said, well, you cannot sort of say public safety means that we need a blanket ban without saying, without evidence that there is a general threat to public safety. So if there's no specific real threat, then you should not use this argument. And the French government had not shown that there was such a threat. The court also pointed out that any threat, such as identity fraud, which France had said, we need this because there could be identity fraud. And the court said, well, anytime that is, you can do that by asking the woman to remove their face veil. They also rejected the gender argument. They said a state cannot really invoke something like this in order to ban a practice that's offended by women, such as the people in this case. And they rejected the human dignity ban and said that could also not justify a blanket ban. And funnily enough, the court here said that it was aware that the clothing in question is perceived as strange by many of those who observe it, but that the wearing of a face veil is an expression of cultural identity, and there is no evidence that women who wear it seek to express contempt of others or to offend against their dignity. So, 2 very positive steps. They rejected the public safety argument, and they rejected the gender argument. Both of these arguments had been accepted by the court as a justified, legitimate aim. So that was quite a good step. But then they looked at the living together argument and accepted that. And here are some of the considerations that the court looked at when they looked at the living together argument. They said it's part of the protection of the rights of others. And some things they started talking about. It has a significant negative impact on the women, like the person in this case. International national observers pointed out that the blanket ban was disproportionate. And the court also expressed concern that certain Islamophobic remarks had been part of the debate on the law. So they said all these things, and they said, well, there was all kinds of things that we need to consider. But then they really came to the conclusion that a ban is justified for living together, which is part of the protection of rights for others. And in a sense, that was quite a surprising or baffling, really, because they had all these things, they considered all these things that could say, we put that in the balance of the individual, and then they went in the balance of the state, the living together, and that bang, decided the balancing and where that fell. So it was quite a surprising, or in a sense, it's a very frustrating case to read, because you read it through and you sort of think, oh good, they're going really in the right direction. And then they come up with this living together argument. And I'm not the only one who doesn't agree with it, because there was quite a clear dissenting opinion. And in the European Court of Human Rights, if the judges don't agree with each other, they can bring out dissenting opinion. There were two judges in this case who did so, and they said the living together argument is very far-fetched and vague. What does it mean, really? And they say it's based on feelings of fears and of unease. People are frightened of women who wear headscarves or who wear face veils. They said there's no right not to be shocked or provoked by different models of cultural and religious diversity. And he said there's no right to enter into a contract with other people. And he said if there is a right to contact with other people, that would mean that there would be an obligation under the convention to come into contact with other people, and that would go against the convention. And they also said it cannot be said that human interaction is not possible if the full face is not shown. And that's true as well, because how much interaction is done by telephone, where you can't see the face? How much interaction is now taking place by people wearing face masks, where you can't see the full face? So they also said the convention system is really meant to protect vulnerable small minorities, and the court didn't do that. So they were very much against what the court had said. And they say also that there were less restrictive, less discriminatory measures that could have been taken. Because they said, well, a partial ban in limited circumstances would be just as good. Now, there was an argument, the applicant in this case claimed that there was discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, and ethnic origin, but the European Court of Human Rights did not really deal with that argument. They said, well, that's justified on the same grounds as the breach of Article 9 is justified. So they didn't really deal with that. Now, this very same ban was then challenged at the Human Rights Committee, which deals with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there the French government brought again up the same justifications for the ban. Public safety, and they said people need to be identified, we have to be careful for identity fraud. And the Human Rights Committee says, well, maybe in some specific circumstances we do need a ban, but in those circumstances usually we can do with a partial ban. It doesn't need to be an absolute blanket ban in all places. And then they also said, well, the law had quite a lot of exemptions. It had exemptions for sporting, artistic, traditional festivals, and for religious processions, etc., for example. So the Human Rights Committee said, well, why should you ban it certain forms, e.g. wearing the niqab or the burqa, but not other forms in all these exemptions? And they had not demonstrated that it was proportionate or that it was the least restrictive measure. So the Human Rights Committee really decided quite differently. Then they looked at the argument of living together. Sorry, that's I'm one slide behind. That's on the safety argument. So they really said there was no evidence. They had not explained enough that it was proportionate. The living together argument, again, they said, very vague and abstract concept. What do you do with that? Well, how do you understand that? And living together as part of the rights and freedoms of others. What rights and freedoms of others then? You haven't explained what specific rights and why they were obstructed by people wearing a face covering for religious reasons and not by the many other coverings that were exempted. They repeated, or they said, well, the dissenters had said, there's no right to interact with people, there's no right to be offended or disturbed by others, by what others wear, and especially by what others wearing the full face veil. And they said, even if we accepted this living together, and they didn't, they said it was not a legitimate aim, but even if we do that, there is no evidence, or it's not proportionate and necessary, because there's no evidence that it could not have been done by less restrictive means. And then this is the first time really that they sort of, a court said a little bit more on the gender equality argument. Basically, on the discrimination argument, they said that's not right. The ban bans all forms of clothing, as France as I pointed out, but it disproportionately impacts on Muslim women and allows for a broad range of exceptions. It said it found a violation of the discrimination Article 26, because it stopped people from, or it prohibited people from covering their face, and that impacted disproportionately on Muslim women. And they said the blanket ban seems to be based on the assumption that face veils were inherently discriminatory and that women were forced to wear it. So basically, they were saying, well, a woman only wears this because she's forced to wear it. And that ignored, according to the Human Rights Committee, that it was a choice for a lot of women. Okay, some people might be forced, but for a lot of women, it's a choice based on their religious belief. A blanket ban might have, actually, according to the committee, the opposite effect of confining women to the homes, impeding their access to employment, to public services, and expose them to abuse and marginalization. And then they came to the conclusion that intersectional discrimination was present here. Discrimination on the basis of gender and religion, because it was specifically disadvantageous for Muslim women. So they looked at the gender or the discrimination argument in a lot more detail. So quite a contrast, and they were looking at the same laws and the same arguments by the government in these cases. The Court of Justice of the European Court of Human Rights said no violation of Article 9, no violation of Article 14. The Human Rights Commission found the same law breached the freedom of religion under Article 18 and breached anti-discrimination law. I now want to move slightly to a different place, but I think this also shows the controversy and the political debates on this. This is the Court of Justice of the European Union, and they have slightly different cases. They looked at cases on the ground of discrimination, and they looked at two cases, which are on the slide, on employees, female employees, with private employers who wanted to wear a headscarf to work. These cases were heard on the same day and were decided on the same day. So the judgment came out on the same day. Ashpita was a receptionist and she worked for G4S, and she was really mostly permanently contracted out to a third party. When she informed her employer that she wanted to start wearing the headscarf, they said, no, we cannot do that. There is a work rule that employees cannot wear visible signs of political, philosophical, or religious belief at work. So the question there was this direct discrimination? And as I said, it's very important whether it was direct or indirect discrimination, because with direct discrimination, there is very few ways of justifying it. Now, Book Naomi was slightly different. It was a design engineer who very occasionally went to customers' sites to do some work. And she went one day to one of the customers' sites, and was asked to remove the hijab when she came back because one of the customer's staff members had complained about it. Now here was the question, and that's a slightly different question, and I won't sort of say too much about it, but basically was the wish of a customer no longer to have a service provided by an employee wearing a headscarf a genuine and determining occupational requirement. There is a provision, and that's one of the justification of direct discrimination. Now, a genuine and determining occupational requirement is, for example, that the Pope should be a Catholic, or that an imam should be Muslim, or probably the Archbishop of Canterbury should be Church of England. So you can say there is some things where you can say we need a Catholic because it's a job of a Pope. What was the decision? And the decision in Aspita is probably much more extensive. The Court of Justice of the European Union said no direct discrimination. It's applied to everybody in the same way, and it did not affect her differently. It was not applied to her differently. Then it says it looked at giving guidance on the justification of indirect discrimination. It basically said it's up to the national court to decide. And what happens in EU cases is that the national court can send something where it's not clear about interpretation, can send it to the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the court will then come back and say, well, this has to be interpreted this way. So they said it's up to the national court to decide whether there's direct or indirect discrimination, but we'll give you some guidance on indirect discrimination, just in case you find that it's indirect discrimination. And they said it is a legitimate aim, yes, because it was a neutrality policy, and that fell under the freedom to conduct a business, which is guaranteed by the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. So there was no problem with the legitimate aim, according to the court. And then they said, is it an appropriate and necessary means? And they said, yeah, it is, as long as it's genuinely pursued in a consistent and systematic manner, and does not make a decision between different religions or different religious, philosophical, and political beliefs. As long as the rule is limited to customer-facing employees, and as long as the employer has considered whether the employee could be moved to a job without contact with customers. Now, in Bugnaoui, they said no, the wish of a customer is not a genuine and determining occupational requirement. There is some of the criticism. People said, first of all, why is a neutrality policy a legitimate aim? The court did not explain why it was a legitimate aim, neither did the court explain why it was a legitimate aim for, in these two cases, both private employers. So maybe you can say a duty of neutrality might be accepted for employees of public authorities who might be seen as representing the state, but can you apply that to a private employee? The court did not really explain that. And then it doesn't fit in with what it said in Ashbita, in Bugnaoui, because why would you have a neutrality policy if it wasn't for the wish of the customers? The one point was, the other point, of course, that the court did not do a very good balancing exercise, did not do the justification test very strongly. And basically it said, well, you can put them in the back office. That's fine. If they want to wear the headscarf, you can put them in the back office. But of course, if you look at discrimination law, I don't think the court would accept if people said, oh yeah, well, my customers don't like to see black people, or they don't like to see women, or they don't like to be served by disabled people. So you can put the whole lot in the back office. I don't think that would be accepted. And of course, it leaves a large group of workers exposed to the negative bans. It does not promote equality of minority group, and it restricts their employment opportunities. Now, there's two pending cases, and in the EU, or these two cases, they referred questions to the court, which really addressed a lot of those criticisms. And I still hope that the court will address all these points. But the Advocate General Rantos has just brought out his opinion. and an advocate general is an advisor to the court. So they bring out an opinion. The court doesn't have to follow it. But in this case, it's slightly different because the cases were allocated to Eleanor Charleston, who was the advocate general for the UK. When the UK left the EU, she was sacked. But because she had done a lot of the work, she brought out a shadow opinion. Now, there is a marked difference between these two opinions. And the Advocate General, Rantos himself, really seems to be pushing headscarf wearers much further out of sight. He seemed to start with a point of view that it must be possible. And that it must be possible to prohibit hijabs for work just because customers want it. And it's possible even if you only prohibit large, prominent, large-scale signs. But he said headscarves are always a large, prominent sign. So that's that. But you can say, and I mean, the advantage of a very bad opinion is that you can write an article about it, which I've, of course, done now, especially with a very good opinion from Eleanor Sharpston and a very bad opinion of the Advocate General, made an ideal way of comparing them. But where does that leave us? Headscarves, backroom. Not be seen at all in public, face covering veils. But what about the other pictures? People might not find it very comfortable to talk to people on the other side. But the fact that that makes you feel uncomfortable, should that mean that you should not allow it? It would go against the values of pluralism and tolerance, which form the basis of the European Convention of Human Rights and of the European Union. So this seems to be, where are we now? And maybe this has something to do with, or you could say the values of the EU, Council of Europe, are pluralism, tolerance, diversity. So why did those courts decide as they did? Has that something to do with the political and public debates? Has it got something to do with the fact that they don't want to interfere with national governments? And maybe it's something to do with the way these judgments are binding or not so binding. The European Court of Human Rights often looks at whether there is a consensus in the member states of the Council of Europe, 47 member states, on issues. And if there is no consensus, then they will say the state has a much broader discretion, called a margin of appreciation. But you could say, well, maybe there is a consensus. 5, 6 countries ban the wearing of face veils, but the rest doesn't. So that means 41 don't. So you could say, is there a consensus? And the Human Rights Committee came to a different conclusion, as I said. Maybe, or they did a more rigorous proportionality test. Was it less influenced by the debate? Now, of course, the Human Rights Committee is a UN body, is a global convention. So maybe the influence of the debates in Europe were less, but I think it's much more to do with the fact that the decisions are less binding than the other two, really. EU directives have to be followed, and then preliminary references ask the Court of Justice of the European Union to make a decision on how things have to be interpreted. And that's binding on national courts. So if the court says this directive has to be explained, or this term in the directive has to be interpreted this way or that way, then that's binding. The European Court of Human Rights is less binding than the Court of Justice of the European Union, probably, but more than the Human Rights Committee. There is some supervision in the European Court of Human Rights, and Alice will know a lot more about this than I do. In the end, there is ways of checking it. The Council of Ministers within the European system can check up if states have done it, can refer states back to the court. But in the end, what can they do if the state just doesn't do anything? And of course, the Human Rights Committee has said in the French headscarf cases that they should provide a remedy for the authors, and that they have to prevent similar violations in future, including reviewing the law. But how binding is that is disputed. How can they monitor it? How can they make steps to do so? So, concluding, it might be more to do with the fact that it's binding, and that means that the European Court of Human Rights, and especially the Court of Justice of the European Union, is more hesitant, or what happens. There are some pending cases. The two headscarf cases where we had the opinions. There's another headscarf case going to the European Court, or waiting for the Court of Justice of the European Union. And there is a headscarf case waiting for the European Court of Human Rights. In my view, they should do a much more rigorous justification and proportionality test. They should weigh the rights of individuals much more. Otherwise, I think they duck their responsibility. So I'm not saying that people should always be allowed to wear headscarf, face veils wherever they want to, but the court should look in much more detail what a prohibition, what a ban means for the person wearing it, and whether there is a way of accommodating it. So that's what I've argued in a number of articles and books. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Erica. I think, do you want to, oh, lovely. Stop screen sharing. Great, thank you.
I'm happy to take questions. Of course, you can always buy my book or borrow it from the library.
That was a really, really interesting presentation, and I made lots of notes actually. As Eleanor said, if anyone has questions, please do put them in the chat. We've had one from Alice. Alice, do you want to unmute and maybe pose that to Erica?
Of course, thank you, Rima, and thanks, Erica. So fascinating as always, and I totally agree with you. You know from kindly doing guest sessions on my human rights module with second years that the SAS case, above all cases that we look at across the year, is the one that tends to get students talking. And I think in all my years of teaching it, universally have contempt for this decision of the court, really. And you know, it's quite incredible actually what strong responses it evokes in students. And as you know, in the session we did this year, many of them raised the question I'm inviting you to sort of expand on here, which is the mandatory wearing of face masks as really fatally undermining the supposed reason, at least, for the burqa ban, in inverted commas. In other words, that you can't communicate with somebody if the lower half of their face is covered. Well, lo and behold, we can. So I just wondered if you think that, especially if face mask wearing does become the norm for a period of time and isn't seen as a sort of emergency thing that will, you know, disappear soon, if it would in fact, you know, lend grounds or lend a basis for having another go at Strasbourg in terms of the French law and Belgian law, etc.
Yeah, I think so. And I think any other attempt at trying to get these courts to change their mind is a good one. But it would, yeah, I think it would provide more ammunition, because it shows that the fact that they said living together for the minimum requirements of life in society. Well, I don't want to talk to everybody, and I don't want to see everybody's face all the time. It's sort of, it seemed to be sort of yeah, in the SAS case, and I think you found out, and your students, the students found out, we both found out as well. It was quite it seemed to come at sort of, well, we have all these arguments, we reject the gender equality, we reject the safety argument, but how can we still find for France? And that seems what they have done. They did not seem to want to upset a country like France, but I think France probably has to think about these things once you start looking at face masks. So it will be at national level, but also it will be very much more ammunition at the European Court of Human Rights. And one of the things that the European Court of Human Rights has done since and that's done in relation to headscarves. The European Court of Human Rights has made its difference between private situations and public situations. And there is a case of a person who was wearing a Jewish coat cap in a courtroom. And there's a case of somebody who wore a hijab in the courtroom who was a witness. And I think the Jewish person was involved in the case. But the court said, well, no, you can say, okay, for public officials, but not if this is a private person. She's just coming to the courtroom. She's giving evidence. You can see her face. What's wrong with that? Yeah, thank you, Alice. And the other one's Hamidovic, I think. So the court has recognized that, and I wonder if that will influence the Court of Justice of the European Union. But I think the face mask is definitely very much ammunition, saying, well, we can all of a sudden we can communicate with a face mask. So what's wrong with that? And there is my picture. Well, yeah, I couldn't find the picture again, but there was a picture on Facebook, on Twitter, of somebody wearing a white headscarf and a white nightcap, and then next to it was, and you to start with, you sort of think, what's the difference between these two pictures? But the second one was a white face mask, and it was hardly any difference, because you really had to look closely to the two pictures. And I couldn't find the picture again, otherwise I might have put that on there because it brought it home. So yes, hope so. Let's hope so.
Yeah, I do hope so. And it really unmasks also the disingenuousness of the supposedly neutral reason, isn't it? It's just about covering the face. It's not about the religious overtones, when quite clearly the development of the law in France and Belgium was absolutely about the religious connotation and not just about covering the face, hence all the exceptions for balaclavas and ski wear and things like that. So the face mask thing actually does completely fatally puncture that argument, doesn't it, for anybody who's willing to listen to it. Thank you, Erica.
Eleanor, you're muted.
The Swiss was exactly the same, and in fact the evidence there were 27 women altogether in the whole of Switzerland who are wearing full facial, face scarves. So for 27 women, we go to a referendum and we pass it. It's a political, of course, it's a political issue, and I think we need to see it as this issue of a political issue. Also around masking around, you could say, security issues as well. But yeah, I mean, we have to unpick it as a political issue more than anything else, because the other thing is the gender reasons are given so little weight, and yet there is a lot of evidence in France. There's a number of articles which have looked at the gender discrimination that is imposed on women who can't work in certain areas. So it's actually doing more harm as well. I mean, I think we should pick that up as in terms of arguments.
And those sort of arguments also go against the living together arguments, because they sort of say the living together argument is also about, there's a lot of people who say, well, women who wear this don't want to be part of us, don't want to be part of society, don't want to join in. And then you sort of say, well, if you, and we have to ban this because they are made to do so by their family or their whatever. But if they are made to do so and you ban it, it means that they don't get out, they don't have employment, they don't go to school, and all the ways in which you could emancipate them doesn't work anymore. So it's a very strange argument, and there is one of the authors has made this argument about, in a sense, it's based on two very contrasting views of Muslim women. On the one hand, there's the Muslim woman who is the victim and who's made to do all this because she's under the thumb of the males in the family. On the other hand, there is the Muslim terrorist who is maybe hiding something under these white clothes and who might have a bomb. And so And in a sense, those two images don't go together, but they do play a role. And it's quite the whole thing about all these arguments, and sort of Sarkozy at one stage talked about a prison of women, and then you think in all the cases that we have seen, the women who wear headscarves, who wear face coverings, are very articulate, educated women who manage to take a case all the way up to the European courts or even to the Human Rights Committee, and that goes also against those issues. So yeah, it is political. It is political, and it's very difficult. I can see the European Court of Human Rights struggling with that and not wanting to upset a big member state. But on the other hand, they should do a much more weighing off of the interest involved, and look at what it means. So, Cassia, did you have a question? You had your hand up.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
No, thank you. It was linking to what Eleanor and you were saying about the gender things. So I don't know anything about law, but since there's a long history, of controlling women's bodies, telling women what to wear, what not to wear. It seems like, if that was sort of made a stronger argument, and I do think that feminist communities haven't been maybe so great at like coming together and making that point and linking it historically, but would that have any weight legally to say that this is against, like basic gender equality, to control women and what they wear and what they do?
It has been brought forward, and in one of the cases that is pending, the National Court actually said, is this not gender discrimination? And the Advocate General totally ignored it, didn't say anything about it. But yes, I think one of the arguments that is always that you can say it is a gender equality issue, because it does. Most religious prescriptions of clothing affect women, and it's an intersection. Of course, Eleanor, it's intersectional as well, because it's women of certain religions, and it's often in one of the cases they said it's race, religion, or ethnicity, religion, and gender, because it's women of the Muslim faith of a certain ethnic background. A lot of people have argued that, but the courts so far haven't picked that up. I think, and maybe, I mean, in the pending cases, the Advocate General just said, oh yeah, but they haven't claimed it under the right directive. No, that's to me also. I don't want to talk about it, so let's just say they've done it wrong. But I mean, they have mentioned it. They have said there is a question saying, is this direct discrimination on the ground of gender and religion? And if the court will do it or not, we have to see. But it's not an argument that has been used or that has been talked about by the court. And the trouble with the European Court of Human Rights is, the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, is that they often say Article 14, the anti-discrimination article, can only be looked at in relation to other articles. It's not a freestanding right to non-discrimination. So they often say, well, okay, we've already said that it's justified because under Article 9. We don't have to look at Article 14. We don't have to look at a discrimination argument anymore. And it's a pity, because it would be something. And lots of people have argued that they should bring a case of. I wish somebody would bring a case of gender discrimination, because the protection against gender discrimination in the EU, for example, is stronger than religious. But
can I just add, the problem is there isn't a single feminism, and there's a large literature I can send you if you haven't looked at it, which is critiquing liberal feminism and the way that it has not supported Muslim women at all. And in France, feminists were deeply, deeply divided. I mean, I actually attended in 1989 the first of a meeting of these three girls who were very intelligent, extremely articulate, and were the first ones to challenge being able to wear a headscarf. Now, one of them didn't even come from purely Muslim household. She was half Jewish and half Muslim. So, and they were incredibly articulate. But you know, that the whole way of representing Muslim women is they're under the sort of the hands of in the patriarchal family and so on. And feminists are so deeply divided in France that it doesn't, you know, that's also one of the problems. And as I say, there's also been the critique of liberal feminism in Germany and in Netherlands for not supporting Muslim women. So that's also a problem in terms of, there isn't a united front, you could say.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The feminists don't agree on whether it is patriarchal or whether it is, and yeah, there are very many different views on that. And like you say, they're very, very divided about it. Yeah, maybe somebody should just bring a case for sex discrimination and not mention religion.
Well, you should maybe give them advice. Okay, it's 2:05. I don't know if we've got any other questions, but just to say, Erica, I'm sorry I didn't read all of that before I finished off the bit in the book that Anastasia and I did, because I wrote at great length, and I did mention some of those cases incidentally. But I'm sorry I didn't have all that. One of the things I did not realize was, in fact, that the last court, the UN actually took gender discrimination seriously, but also that was accepted by the European Court as well. So thank you very much for, I think, a really fascinating tour de force of the judgments, because I think also what it shows is the fact that, you know, there is a socio-legal studies that it's really interesting bringing together social sciences and legal, you know, because to think about what kind of arguments the law makes, it's not black box law, it's law that talks to us about societal attitudes and discourses, you know. So thanks very much.
Okay, yeah, no, you're very much right. And that's why I wanted to sort of start off with saying it is a controversial issue. It is a political issue, and the courts cannot but be influenced by this whole thing. So I think that's the problem. And we all know where we want the courts to go, but whether they go there, we wait and see for the next cases. So.
Okay, so thanks very much. And as I say, the talk, in case anybody, not ones who are here, but in case you know anybody who would like to listen to it, they will be posted shortly when Rima on our YouTube on SPRC. Rima